This is the third in a series of interviews with graduate students who are working on a research project about electric weeding in organic perennial crops, funded by NIFA OREI. I'm Alice Formiga of eOrganic, and I'm here with Linda Brewer of Oregon State University to talk with Aaliyah Butler-Jones of Cornell University. She's going to give us an update about results from her experiments using a Zaso electric weeding machine in organic orchard crops.
I'm Aaliyah Butler-Jones. I'm a PhD student in Dr. Lynn Sosnowski's lab, and I am based at Cornell University. So I'm the East Coast representative for this, one of the East Coast representatives for this OREI project. So I wear tongs in UC Davis, and Marcelo's student Lucia, if I remember correctly, is in Oregon. I'm in New York, which is quite a very different system than the West Coast. So, just briefly to give some background, I work on electrical weed control, like all three of us, all three graduate students do. And just a little background about electrical weed control. This technology was first patented in the 1880s. I like to call it an old but new technology. So the first patents were granted in the late 19th century, and most of the work on this technology was done in the 1970s and 1980s. And then there was a precipitous drop in publication and research on this topic until the 2010s or so. And this method generally works by passing an electrical current through a plant, and it injures both the above ground and below ground structures. The actual susceptibility of a plant to electrical weeding depends on many different factors, both within the plant and also the application environment. So, like plant size, its architecture, so the branching and like growth points and all those things, its maturity, its water content, but also soil conditions make a difference too. How soil moisture, as Tom talked about briefly in his interview about like a month or two ago, soil moisture can make a big difference. Altogether, this is a really exciting, novel piece of technology for several reasons, but there's very little research on it, especially research this millennium. That's changing in the last few years, as we've seen. And so I just wanted to show some pictures of what does this look like in New York. So these pictures are showing the unit that we use is this Zaso electro herb unit, and it has these two fins on the front, and on these like under these mower decks type things. Instead of having mower blades, we have electrodes as shown in picture D, and we can change the width, and we can change the height, the application height, all those things. So this is made by Zaso, and it's technically set up for coffee production, but we use it in New York for apple and grape and other perennial crop production. So that's basically managing weeds in the like weed-free herbicide strip, but instead of using herbicides, we're using electricity. So this is just showing picture A and B are just showing the type of like what does it look like after we actually run an electrical weeder. And so this is 1 week after treatment. And the thing that's really cool about it, one of the questions we had was, because when I first started, I'd never saw it. Would we see a very distinct strip, or will we see more of a gradient in terms of effect? And no, what we see are very, very distinct strips of, it almost looks like a, for lack of a better word, scorched earth strip, and then this green weedy area between. So this is where the tractor body went over. And not only that, it's changing application, the amperage level unit setting does change the effectiveness. So the level of control 1 week after treatment does vary. So in picture B, that's what you're seeing. The one furthest on the right, that what I'm circling with my cursor, that's our untreated. The one furthest on the left is our lowest setting. So that's setting 5. That's probably averaging about 13 or 15 amps. And then this one in the middle is setting 3. and that's averaging 40s, mid 40s to low 50s amps. While this unit can be set from 1 to 5, we haven't our tractor, the tractor we have it mounted on isn't a strong enough, a large enough engine to reach 1 and 2. Ironically, 1 is the highest setting and 5 is the lowest. That confused me when I saw it too. So we tend to run everything between 3 and 5. So 3, 4, 5. And it's we've already this summer will be my second or third summer, really my second summer of collecting robust data. The first summer was definitely trying to get acquainted with this piece of equipment because Lynn, my PI, Lynn Sosnowski, she got her unit a little bit after Dr. Moretti and Dr. Hansen. So that summer 2022, was really just getting acquainted with the equipment. But even with this work, says preliminary work, we saw some really interesting things. And then we expanded these studies last year. So I'm going to just show some of the main findings from these studies. So the big picture, the main takeaway that I want you to leave with is that from what we've observed thus far, electrical weeding is effective at reducing weed cover without reducing soil microarthropod abundance. So that's just the number of them. So this graph on the right is showing the percent reduction in weed cover 15 days after treatment. On a y-axis is percent of the untreated control. So pretty much to account for the weeds tend to cover fields in a somewhat patchy manner. It's not a homogeneous surface. So what we did is we ran Zaso, and in that middle strip where the tractor drives over that does not receive an application, we would take Canapeo, so percent cover measurements within the weeded strip, then within the weedy strip that was directly adjacent to it, and then make the calculations of percentage of that untreated control. So that's what that UTC of untreated control on that y-axis. And then on our x-axis are the speed in kilometers per hour. The fill is showing that's pretty much unit setting. So this red color is setting 5, and this teal blue color is setting 3. And we did see that electrical weeding reduced weed cover 65 to 99% 15 days after treatment, and that it seems to show that amperage setting, so the amperage had more of an effect on weed cover than travel speed, which is useful to know. So both 1.7 miles per hour and kilometers per hour and 2.6 kilometers per hour, both of those things, those are pretty slow speeds. But if a grower can go almost double the speed and still see a similar effectiveness, that can be useful because that grower is able to cover more area. Another thing that was really great to see for these preliminary results, these are like results from summer 2022, was that electrical weeding did not appear to reduce soil microarthropod counts or impact microbial respiration. So one of the questions we got very often from growers was, okay, so we're applying this electrical current to weeds, that's all well and good, but what's happening in my soils? What's happening to my soil health? What's happening to the biological organisms within the soil? And we genuinely couldn't answer that question. That's a very good question, but it's one that we couldn't answer. So what we did is we limited our sampling to the top 5 centimeters. So that's about 2 inches, because our thought process was, if we're going to see any type of changes, it will probably be at the very top of the soil profile as opposed to 30 centimeters or a foot deep. And in regards to the impact on the soil's weed seed bank, we saw inconclusive results with these preliminary studies. So in summer 2023, we expanded it, and what I'm going to focus on are the bare ground trials we did, and then the orchard-based trials. For our bare ground trials, the purpose of these experiments was to evaluate the impact of electrical weed control application parameters, more specifically speed and unit settings, so amperage on weed performance, microarthropod abundance and diversity, in soil microbial abundance and activity. So to do this, we've been conducting a 2-year randomized complete block design um, trial in unplanted fields at Cornell Agritech, where my lab is based. So that's in the Finger Lakes region of New York. You might be wondering, well, what do you mean unplanted fields? What we mean is we are literally in weedy fields. They are agronomic fields or agricultural fields. They're usually planted to vegetables or maybe some type of field crops. And we don't plant any crops. We just let the in situ seed bank weed population and the seed sprout up, and then we run it in that field. And again, we applied electricity with the Zaso electroherb unit. So we had 2 speeds and then 3 amperage settings. The mustard color is showing that's equivalent to setting 5. The cyan is setting 4, and then this green is the setting 3. And then on our y-axis, we have speed. So 4.8 kilometers per hour. That's about 2.5, 3 miles per hour. That's a really fast way to run it. It was interesting to see. And then 1.9 was our slow speed. And then again, we have this percent weed cover reduction of the untreated control. And what we saw was somewhat surprising, considering the preliminary result. It wasn't terribly surprising. Again, we observed this impact or we observed this result that speed doesn't really seem to make much of a difference, but also amperage didn't make much of a difference either. We saw higher reduction at slower, like the highest reductions at the slowest speeds, or the highest, or more importantly, the highest amperages, but it wasn't enough to be statistically significant. So that was percent weed reduction in weed cover 20 days after treatment. And then we went back in 28 days after treatment to measure biomass. And again, we see a very similar result of electrical weeding of any type that we tested here significantly reduced dry weed biomass compared to the untreated control, but the actual application parameters didn't segregate out in a statistically significant way. So that's still a really, to me, a very promising result, because it's showing that, yes, this is effective at reducing weed cover. It is effective at reducing weed biomass. And the actual nitty gritty doesn't seem to be as impactful, especially at like a tractor scale implement. So that's very exciting. We're still in the process of processing the microarthropods and microbial samples, but we're going to share those results and present those at the weed science conferences coming up in 2025. So that will be WSSA, Weed Science Society of America annual conference or annual meeting, and then also the Northeastern Weed Science Society. One thing that I will say anecdotally was this year when I went back into field 3 and looked at the field, you could actually see some strips still compared to the treated area compared to the untreated area, and that's been at least 6 months. So that was exciting to as well. In addition to conducting some bare ground trials, we're conducting these established orchard trials as well to pretty much figure out the impact of electrical weed control on weed crop competition, and then also crop injury and health compared to current organic management practices. So there's 2 main established orchard trials. Both of them are 2-year randomized complete block design trials in organic apple research blocks. One of them is in a mature orchard, and the other one is in a younger high density orchard. So the mature orchard pretty much has three treatments. One is one speed, one setting of the electrical weeder compared to shallow cultivation with a wonder weeder. So on the East Coast, that's commonly what's used in organic uh, orchard production is cultivation within the top 8 centimeters. So that's about 3 inches compared to an untreated control slash in organic treatment that receives organic herbicide application. And these treatments were applied once a month. We expected to have 4 to 5 treatments in a season. Last year in 2023, we had 5 applications. This year, we'll probably have about 4 or 5. This is compared to our stacked weed management trial. So where our mature orchard trial, we just compared 3 completely separate treatments. In our stacked weed management trial, we wanted to see, okay, well, what if a grower is using this synergistically? What do I mean by that? Well, what if this grower might cultivate, a grower might just do run the electrical weeder, but also a grower might run the electrical weeder and then about a week later cultivate after that. Would we see any type of synergistic effect of using these 2 tools together? So we ran a trial and we're going to do it again this year in an expanded fashion of comparing an untreated control. So it received no type of treatment. It's our weedy control, cultivation with the wonder weeder, electrical weeding, and then electrical weeding followed by cultivation a week later. And we again saw some pretty cool results. So the graph on the left is showing the mature orchard trial, and the graph on the right is showing our stacked weed management trial. And what we saw with our orchard trial is that in terms of weed biomass at the end of the season, so this was collected in late September, early October, cultivation and electrical weeding both significantly reduced weed biomass compared to our untreated control or our treatment that could received a organic herbicide application, but they didn't significantly differ between the two of them. And then for a stack management trial, we saw that again, all 3 treatments, cultivation, electrical weeding, and then electrical weeding in combination with cultivation had significantly lower percent weed cover 23 days after treatment compared to our untreated control. But these treatments actually seem to segregate out, and it appears that this stack treatment was more effective at reducing weed cover compared to cultivation alone. And this electrical weeding alone is basically a middle ground between the two of them. So that was a really great result to see as well. And one thing for that we observed from our tractor operator, which this is like anecdotal, was he said, which I thought was interesting, was that when he in the areas in which he in which the Zaso unit was run, if he had a cultivator behind it a week later, he found that it was easier and faster to cultivate those areas as opposed to areas in which no electrical application was made. So that's exciting. We've also, for our mature orchard trial, we've collected time data and also fuel consumption data to see, are there any comparisons? It is somewhat hard to make comparisons between the cultivation and our electrical weeder because the electrical weeder is on a larger tractor. It does use more fuel, given that I should say it does appear to use more fuel than our cultivation equipment, and it is slower to do. You can't run this unit as fast as a cultivator, but it's just as effective in terms of reducing weed cover. And when it seems to have it seems to work synergistically with cultivation. So we are expanding these trials this year and pretty much expanding this stacked weed management trial, which is very exciting as well. And another thing that I think is important to mention is that another trial that we're doing, which is going to be exciting, I'm very excited about it, is we're pretty much mimicking the impact of electrical weeding on young trees and grapevines. So this summer, we're starting this trial this summer, and we are literally planting a mini orchard and a mini vineyard, and we're going to run the electrical weeder under different settings, unit settings and different speeds. And then what are going to do is a sub sample of these trees that we've planted from each plot are going to be excavated and potted up and put in the greenhouse. And then from there, we'll make measurements in terms of tree diameter or trunk diameter, survival, bloom, all those types of things as well. So we're trying to, the way that I think about my research is almost like looking at this from different scales, from a like what is happening just with the weeds in the soil, what's happening when you put this in crop at a very early time frame, and what is happening when you put it in crop when the orchard is more mature. So I'm really excited about all of those things.
Sure.
Yeah, so that's pretty much what I've been up to.
That sounds great, Aaliyah.
Wonderful.
I want to ask a question. I want to tag on to something you said at the very beginning of your slide set, and that was about the soil characteristics and how they seem to affect the efficacy of the electricity. And you said something about specifically about soil moisture. Can you share with us what difference soil moisture makes in weed die-off with the electrical weed treatments?
Yeah, so we haven't tested soil moisture
Okay.
specifically as a parameter, uh, primarily because New York is not a good place to do it. Um,
Because it rains all year long in New York?
because it's wet here.
Okay.
Yeah. So California, where Tong is,
Mm-hmm.
it's like in the sense of like a summer without rains.
Yes.
It's much easier to test that there,
Okay.
because in New York we would have to do basically exclusion trials,
Right.
and that's very hard. We
Okay.
basically have to have like big strips of tent. It's not worth it. So
Okay.
I actually broached the idea of doing moisture, like looking at moisture, and my committee was like, yeah, no, not in New York, you're not. So, but what I will say is that the unit pretty much runs consistently around 240, 250 volts,
Mhm.
but the amperage, we can only set it 345, but the actual amperage that is being applied very, I've noticed that it somewhat varies on conditions. It is, if it's a wetter time or wetter soil, it is, we see different amperage readings than if it's drier. So every time, what's something I forgot to mention is I take soil moisture measurements every time we make an application
Okay.
to try to take some measurements to potentially account for that variability.
Mhm.
And every orchard strip we run it, or anywhere where we run it, pretty much I'm on the phone with the tractor operator, and I get a reading of the amperage and the voltage at 2 or 3 time points in every single
Okay.
plot.
Okay.
That's so that we can make an average. That's why in the
Okay.
labs it says mean amperage,
Yes, yes.
as
Okay.
opposed to something that's more concrete. I would
So,
think it probably has
mhm.
to do with the conductivity.
Yes, exactly. Because that's what I
Mm-hmm.
was going to say. More water means that you've got more minerals in the soil, water, And it's
Yeah.
actually the ions in the water that are transmitting the
Yeah,
electricity.
exactly. Water is way, like, from a conductivity standpoint, from my understanding, water is way more conductive than plants. And
Okay.
this is also where the maturity, the actual characteristics of the plants can make a difference as well.
Mhm.
So something that's more lignified, something that's more woody,
Mhm.
is not as susceptible to
Mhm.
electrical weeding as opposed to like a nice succulent broadleaf.
Okay.
And one thing that Lynn saw that I thought was really interesting is this is the relationship of soil conditions and plant water content was anecdotally when she was running it. Actually, I think she took some data on this. I just don't have it.
Mhm.
But the point is, when they ran the electrical weeder, it was a weed zapper. So
Okay.
it has an electrified bar as opposed to these decks.
Mhm.
And she ran it in beets, and the
Mhm.
soil was particularly dry. This is a non-selective application method. So the way that you select is just architecture. If
Okay.
the beets were particularly susceptible, if they got contacted, if they were contacted by the electrode, to be killed.
Mhm.
And it makes sense
Mhm.
because you have this nice fleshy taproot of a beet compared to this dry soil all around it.
Mhm.
The electricity is going to go by the path of least resistance.
Mhm.
So I something that will be is a it could be potentially very interesting to look into. I can't do that in a particularly efficient manner.
Mhm. Okay, great. No, that was great. I appreciate your discussion and your thoughts about moisture. So if it seems to be more effective when the tissue is less lignified or is just more turgid, more juicy, then that would suggest that younger weeds are going to be more susceptible. Yes?
Yes,
Okay,
exactly.
great. Good.
I had a couple questions too. I thought it was really interesting at the beginning of the presentation that you mentioned that this technology has been around since the 1880s or so. And I'm just curious if you have any idea why the research on this stalled. Do you think it was because it was too dangerous, or the technology wasn't precise enough,
Mm.
or the machines were too expensive? Or, I'm just curious.
Yeah. So I'll say that the first patents were granted in the late 1800s.
Mm.
There is some research on electric weed control and like the impact of electricity. I remember before I started graduate school, I I happened upon a paper from the late 1970s
Mm.
that was on electrical weed control, and like it was looking at like corn leaf scorching of the leaf blade tip and active electricity, yada blah blah blah. But the main papers prior to what's come out in the last 5 or so years, those were mainly in the 1980s, the
Mm.
late 70s to mid 80s, and then it drops off precipitously, like you mentioned. I can't really speak to. I feel like part of it is just speculation on my part, so I will give that context first. But I don't think what I've observed and what I am thinking, I think there's several factors. The research was in its infancy back then, and in the early 1990s is when herbicide tolerant, well, there's many herbicide tolerant crops, specifically genetically engineered herbicide tolerant crops came out.
Mm.
And there was more, at least from what I think might have at least influenced this, there was more of a pivot in terms of weed management, in to focus or utilize more herbicides, and not only more herbicide application but a narrower swath of herbicides. So if I'm remembering correctly, glyphosate, ready glyphosate resistant soybean was first released in 1990, between 94 and 1996. And then you see within the next 10 years, like over 90% of soybean is planted to this crop. And within that, like the 1990s, early 2000s, glyphosate resistant corn, glyphosate resistant cotton crops, those seeds with these traits, this trait technology was released. So what may have influenced it sort of pivoting of focus was that management for many acres became less diversified. That's just the reality of the situation. For organic growers, it's different because they can't use synthetic herbicide. So that really narrows down, and there's much of a reliance on cultivation. But the majority of acreage in the United States is not organic acreage, conventional acreage. And I think what may have happened was basically we had something that wasn't a silver bullet, but was somewhat treated or viewed as this will keep us, this will hold us down, this will provide main weed control that we would need for forever how long we thought. And there would, because of that, there was less impetus to look at some of these alternative weed management strategies and novel technologies. So I think that's at least partially responsible for this like bimodal curve in terms of the publication records on this topic. And I don't think it's surprising either that there's a resurgence in interest now in for both organic and conventional growers. On the organic side, it's shown repeatedly that like intensive cultivation and basically soil disturbance isn't great from a health standpoint. There's many benefits for tillage cultivation, but there's also drawbacks to intensive repeated physical disturbance to soil. So many organic growers are interested in what are some alternatives, specifically non-soil disturbance-based alternative weed management strategies. And then for conventional growers, well, herbicide-resistant weeds. There's more and more species that have evolved more and more herbicide sites of actions and active ingredients. So the suite of herbicides that were previously available that is shrinking. And then there's also a changing regulatory environment in terms of herbicides coming to market. Very few herbicides, new active ingredients are coming to market. And then also there's changing consumer perspectives and views on herbicide crops. So all of those things together make it sort of this like perfect right time to look at this stuff. And I think growers are interested. They want to know could this work? But also there's like people that I speak with, they seem very excited whenever I tell them I study electrical weeding. They're like, what do you mean? And I'm like, we literally plants and kill them and see what happens. So I apologize to be somewhat long-winded, but I think it's
great.
many different factors influencing that like dip in publication record. I think it was just priorities were shifted elsewhere.
Yeah, that's a really interesting answer. Thank you.
It is.
Yeah, I have a real simple question too, one that I'm sure that we'll get from a lot of people, which is just like, how fast can this go? I know you went up to, I think it was 4.9 miles per hour or so.
Yeah.
Mhm.
It was 4.8
Okay,
kilometers per hour. So that's about like 3 miles per hour.
Mhm.
I would not, running it at 3 miles per hour doesn't seem very fast from a walking speed or a driving speed. 3 miles per hour with this piece of equipment on a tractor is very fast. So I would say you're probably not going to want to go faster than 2.5 miles per hour. And that 2.5 is probably pushing it. So yeah, probably about 1.5, 2 is like the upper limit of what I think a lot of operators would be comfortable doing.
Okay, great. That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Aaliyah. It's been great to hear your presentation, and I really look forward, I'm sure everyone looks forward to hearing what comes next and what you find in the coming year. So thank you so much for taking the time to present that to us and preparing the slides.
Thank you so much for having me.
If you'd like to learn more about electric weeding, please visit the website for this NIFA OREI funded project at eorganic.info/electric weeding. You can also find more videos about electric weeding on a playlist on the eOrganic YouTube channel. We'll be sharing more information as the research project progresses.